Crucible was written in 1953 by Arthur Miller, and although it's set in Salem, 1692, Arthur Miller had his own context in mind, and especially the Second Red Scare and persecution of people in search of communist spies in the US. The Lion and the Jewel was written by Wole Soyinka in 1959 and describes the struggle of townspeople in Nigeria, and especially a young village belle city and her struggle between traditionalism and modernization brought by Western influences of the country. The Crucible was set in 1692, Salem, Massachusetts. Salem was a theocracy and also a puritanical village, meaning that the people in the village were Puritans originating from Europe, but who chose to immigrate to North America to find their own place in the world and establish a religious group that followed their beliefs specifically. At the time of Salem and the setting of the Crucible, there were a lot of disputes between the native North Americans and the Puritans. This influenced the character of Abigail and how she threatens her girlfriends by recalling how she witnessed her parents being murdered by Indians. The Puritans are known for having really uptight attitudes about religion and how it impacts everyday life, and this is reflected by the importance that Judge Danforth and Samuel Parris put on religious practices such as going to church. 17th century society was unequal in the sense that there was still slavery and society was patriarchal. This constructed a hierarchy that was visible in the cycle of accusations that began with the lowest in the hierarchy, which was Tituba in the play, and then went on to Abigail, who was a woman. Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible in the time of the Second Red Scare. After World War II has ended, there were increasing tensions between the Soviet, Russia, and US. Senator Joseph McCarthy, in his speech to Americans, criticized society that they were not emotional enough in their search for communists, and this led to almost a witch hunt of communists. Joseph McCarthy and the House of Un-American Activities both looked for communist sympathizers and traitors in their own ways. The House of Un-American Activities put sanctions towards actors, writers, and directors, one of them being Arthur Miller himself, and being accused by either of the two courts meant being socially isolated, potentially losing one's job. Fearing further interrogation and getting into more trouble, Arthur Miller set the play in Salem witch trial periods. This would not only elicit patriotism in the hearts of the audience because of the pre-independence setting, but also because 1950s society acknowledged the witch trials as being a crime against humanity. Arthur Miller specifically chose the witch trials because they ended not only in true injustice but also in death of innocent people. This was his main purpose in showing the audience how further continuation of the courts in the 1950s era would perhaps lead to something just as sinister. After World War II, Nigerian people felt a rise in nationalism, even though the Nigerian country was still not independent and was a protectorate of the United Kingdom. This sparked a new line of thinking that the Nigerian people should deserve their own country. The focus of the play is to represent the aspects of becoming a country after being colonized for so many years, especially through the clash of Westernly influenced modern societies inside the country and other more secluded areas with traditional and old values still attached. Lakunle, the school teacher, is obviously one indication in the play of someone who has been exposed to a Western education and could be a representation of the Western culture in Nigeria, probably from the southern region, where all the port cities were, and more chances to be exposed to the English influence. Tribalism in Africa was still dominant even after colonialization, which meant that tribes were suppressed of their original power by the authorities of outside countries such as the UK. And tribal leaders were still attaching themselves to traditional values since they were more isolated and in the northern regions of Nigeria and could be represented by Baroka, the village's chief. Being set in an isolated village of Lijunle, most characters such as Sidi, Sadiku, and Baroka are represented as uneducated and uncultured in contrast to the Western society. Since Lakunle is really the only one in the village who was exposed to and supports the Western culture, it's representative of how the bigger proportion of the population in Nigeria viewed the young radicalists who wanted to fundamentally change the way that Yoruba culture was in authority of people, as seen by how Lakunle is laughed at through the whole. Other important details included in the setting of the play are things that happened before the play but are mentioned, such as the railway plan to go through the village of Ilijunle but ends up being scrapped after Baroka corruptedly bribes the man in charge of it. This represents what was actually happening in the time of the play being written, which railroads were connecting Nigeria together. During the time of the play being written, the clash of cultures in Nigeria didn't stop traditionalists from utilizing whatever technology they felt they had the right to use, such as guns, even though they may not have accepted other things such as medical and scientific information and technology, which is also represented in the play by Baroka. Overall, Arthur Miller was very specific on which setting he wanted to use to criticize the court because it, the patriotic values it held and the in fallacies and logic corresponded to his own times and the Second Red Scare. Soyinka was very ambiguous upon specific details in his play, such as the time and exact location of where it was, which helped his purpose of raising questions about society rather than specifically indicating historic value of the setting, such as what Arthur Miller chose to do in The Crucible.